Okay, so I've been instructed or told that it's time to proceed. So I'd like to first welcome everybody who has joined our session today. Really excited to be having this conversation on the policy track discussion in terms of lessons learned from electrification of MUDs or multi-unit dwellings, or sometimes being referred as multi-family buildings as well, because MUD is short for MUD and it has interesting implications that some people might not like the association. Um, but if anything, I like to first welcome everyone to be here. Really excited to have you. And just a few quick notes for everybody who are attending. If you have any questions that you would like to ask any of the panelists, please refer to the right-hand side of your conference webpage window, and there's going to be a Q&A session where you can click the button of ask a question and you can type your question there, and we will be monitoring the Q&A column there and making sure that we address those questions and direct them to the proper panelists on today's panel as well. So before we dive into the discussion, I'm going to give everybody a quick introduction of myself and also the panelists today, which is a really strong panel, and then I will pass the mic over to Brendan, Jim, and then Sean in that order, so that they can introduce themselves a little bit more than I can, and of course introduce their organization as well. So my name is Eric Huang. I'm a program manager at Fourth, one of the co-organizer of today's conference, and I have been working on multi-unit dwelling charging facilitation, best practices, and understanding its barriers in the past couple years. My focus, or my major focus area, has been on EV charging facilitation or EV charging infrastructure deployments overall. And I am really excited to see MUD being a separate individual topic being discussed here. And I'm really excited to learn more from today's panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Brendan to introduce himself. And Brendan is with Envoy. And Brendan, go ahead.
Hey everybody, my name is Brandon. So I represent Envoy Technologies, and we are an electric vehicle sharing program, and we provide electric vehicle car sharing as an amenity. So we provide that for multi-unit dwellings. We provide that for universities, workplaces, closed community car sharing, and we're an all-electric fleet. I've been in the industry for about 5 years now, previously working with General Motors. So I'm excited to talk with you guys and learn some more about what everybody's interested in.
Thank you, Brendan. And then we'll pass the microphone to Jim.
Sure. Yeah. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Jim King. I'm the president and CEO of FAHI. We're a membership organization and financial intermediary working in Appalachia and across other persistent poverty regions in the country. Our primary focus is persistent poverty, of which 85% in this country are in rural places, which is our secondary focus.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. And then last but not least, we have Sean Caldwell. And Sean, would you like to introduce yourself and the company that you work for as well?
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, I'm Sean Caldwell, and really excited to be here for this panel discussion. I am currently with Guidehouse, which is a management consulting firm, formerly Navigant / PwC's managed sector for their public division. Anywho, currently Guidehouse, and I'm in our Southeast market team. I'm an associate director with the firm, focused primarily on electric transportation, working with utilities, not only in the Southeast, but nationwide. And from a background perspective, I have recently been involved with helping various electric utilities stand up electric transportation support programs, whether it's through rebates or through direct investment in physical infrastructure and the advocacy for increased adoption of electric vehicles. I've been in this space for roughly 6 or 7 years now, and just excited to continue to be in this space and to continue to help one of the primary stakeholders, that being the electric utility industry, continue to evolve and come along this journey with us. So again, excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sean. So as everybody is fully aware, we have a really strong panelist here with a lot of different experiences coming from helping electric utility to basically implement electric transportation infrastructure programs, to professionals who are right in the middle of EV car sharing and making sure those vehicles are available to the community, and of course, professionals that's coming from the area to really help rural communities or underserved communities to combat poverty, and also making sure they have access to the resources and mobility options that they need. So, if anything, if I may just provide some basic context that I think is helpful from my own study or my own experiences when it comes to EV charging at multi-dwellings, just as a Kickstarter or an appetizer for everyone's discussion. MUD or this kind of multifamily buildings like apartment buildings and condos make up approximately 34% of the nation's housing inventory. That is a number from 2017, which this number could be potentially higher with more development being done in major metropolitan areas. However, in terms of EV charging, home-based EV charging at MUDs, it only takes account for about 5%. That really means that people don't really have a lot of access towards EV charging, or even towards EV if they happen to live in MUDs. And I'm really curious to hear from the panelists today is why, from your perspective, specifically, either your personal perspective or your company's perspective, why would you care about EV charging at MUDs? And also, what would you see in terms of a connection from having access to charging at MUD towards equity as a topic overall? And whoever that wants to jump in can go first.
I'd like to jump in if you guys don't mind. One, I'll just kind of speak from a personal level in terms of why I think it's important. And I'll speak to it coming from the underserved community standpoint. So one of the most rewarding programs that I work with here at Envoy is a lower income community where we provide kind of electric vehicle car sharing for communities that wouldn't typically have this. This gives them access to doctor's appointments, grocery stores, just essential everyday services that we kind of take for granted by having other kind of means of transportation. But when you're able to kind of find a community that really needs these services and doesn't have many other alternatives, it's very rewarding to see kind of how this plays out. Also, kind of just from a personal standpoint, I'm a pretty stereotypical millennial. I've lived in downtown Los Angeles where parking is just atrocious. Obviously, there is like a gray film above the city because of all the exhaust fumes. Reducing the amount of cars on the road, reducing the need for everybody to own a vehicle is really important to me. Just looking towards the future, we discussed earlier about climate change. Just reducing the amount of vehicles on the road is very important, and providing that to multi-unit dwellings is I think, essential for kind of getting that kicked off.
Hey, that good feedback there, Brandon. Jim, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Oh, no, you started, but I'm happy to jump in. I'll follow you. That's great.
Sounds good. There's always kind of the hokey pokey who's going to speak up first. But and I apologize to our attendees. My camera, I don't know what happened. The system upgrade over the last couple of days. But anywho, Brandon, I'd like to just kind of latch on to that piece in terms of, millennials and access, specifically as this panel is, focused on MUDs. But when you think of, the ebbs and flows, so the shift of populations from out of the city back into the city and vice versa, where there's a higher concentration and density of homes, residences, condos, apartment buildings, in order for, electric transportation to really, get anchored and kind of be here to stay, obviously you got to have access to chargers. And in the dense populated communities, that oftentimes is less available, right? So kind of cracking concrete and all of the technical things behind, retrofitting some of the existing structures makes it difficult. But having that absolutely increase the access to, that, again, the millennial population, those who now, have means, have interest, maybe more green affinity, a little bit more conscious about kind of where we're going from a climate perspective, but just so happen to live in an area where, it's not sprawling and, it's less access to some of the infrastructure to build out charging and install charging. So, from an equity perspective, MUDs in highly concentrated, densely populated areas is extremely important. And then the other end of the spectrum where, in our communities where, those who are less affluent or sort of at a lower socioeconomic tier that happen to live in apartments just because that's, their lifestyle at that point or by choice, then it is a matter of you still want to make sure there's access across the spectrum. So electric vehicles aren't just catering to kind of those that are highly affluent or at, sort of the upper end of the income or wealth spectrum. So for those kind of reasons, I look at, why MUDs are important.
Yeah, definitely agreed.
Oh, my experience and perspective come from a different part of the country than concentrated urban centers. We're based in Kentucky, as I may have mentioned in my opening remark, and we're also a multifamily developer as well as just single family as well. So our work involves about 8,000 units a year. Half of those are multifamily, and our entire target market are lower income households. And as an additional lens, sorry to make it sound clunky, but we do concentrate our work on areas of persistent poverty. When we think of poverty in this country, many people think of more densely populated places, but 85% of persistent poverty in our country is located in what would be considered a rural census tract or a rural county. And 60% of those places are Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So for me, that immediately becomes poverty as a lens for also where we want to address equity. When we think about what we want to introduce and how we want to think about what goes into a unit of housing, particularly multifamily in this case, Mark Twain once said, "When the end of the world comes, I'd like to be in Kentucky because everything happens there 10 years later than anywhere else." Well, that's cute. But when we talk about the introduction of things like clean energy, broadband access, and now electric vehicles, the slower we are in forcing investment in places where people are least likely to get it, then we just continue to not only drive a digital divide, but that continues to build what is a growing wealth gap in this country. And so that's where this issue really comes alive for us. So we just got funded by the Department of Energy to put charging stations in 6 locations, of where there are none. And those are all associated with multifamily dwelling because there is basically no other access in those communities.
Thank you. And if I may, I really think that we were able to parse out a lot of really interesting informations coming from different panelists, obviously. And I realized it sounds like in terms of the approach that we are about to sort of try to discuss in terms of a best practice of how to facilitate this, I felt that there is going to be sort of a difference between the urban approach versus the rural area approach, because they are fundamentally different when it comes to the composition of the populations and also their needs overall. Urban centers, potentially it's densely populated and needs just maybe some maybe transportation modes that can get them from point A to point B fairly easily, where rural areas, there might be a longer travel involved. And I'm curious about, this is a question for everybody that can feel free to jump in. If we were to build a equitable access towards mobility, considering for MUD residents overall in either rural or urban areas, what will be your preferred choice when it comes to this equitable access? Is it going to be charging infrastructure first, or is it going to be a combination of other mobility options, considering rural or urban? And also feel free to pick one that you prefer to answer.
I think Sean's going to have a lot to say on this, but I like to say that my thought would be that the infrastructure needs to develop first. I think when you look outside of, and I'm so happy to hear kind of what Jim's doing in Kentucky, but I think outside of like California, maybe Seattle, you really see a lack in the infrastructure there. And for us to really kind of shift over to the electric future that I think we kind of all need, we're going to need that infrastructure established. I didn't have a lot of experience in the infrastructure development prior to working with this current company. But it is a huge barrier of access for people that necessarily don't have the funding for this. It's not, the mobility options are relatively cheap compared to the infrastructure development. So I think developing that infrastructure in places where it's most needed, whether they be rural or urban, is probably the first step there.
I'd like to sort of pop in here because Sean's the expert and I don't want to have to follow him on that, but I would totally agree. I would totally agree with that, Brandon. And not just because that is sort of my more my field to think about the brick and mortar, if you will. But we, as an example, and I don't know that rural and urban are so different, other than the economics and the change that population density changes what feels financially feasible. And we can come back to that around advocacy and some other things about sort of political will. If we're going to go there, I hope we will. But I do think you have to have the infrastructure in place, or there's no reason for people to adapt, or it will be impossible for them to in some markets where not enough gets built. We're still well behind on broadband right now. There are funders I cannot access in a national competition because we just don't even have the broadband speed to like compete, and that is an infrastructure failure.
Sean.
Well, yeah. So I'll chime in here. It's the proverbial, the chicken or the egg, right? I think that if I were to look back, call it 7 years ago, when working with one of the utilities in the Southeast, I was like, oh yeah, let's think about how many vehicles are being projected. And of course, every forward-looking projection generally has a hockey stick trajectory. Like, as soon as this thing hits, it'll be 1 million vehicles sold tomorrow. And, you got to have infrastructure in place. And then the reality kind of hits that, yeah, I mean, that's still, a pretty capital intensive investment when you move beyond, residential or kind of workplace level 2 charging to think about DC fast at, the 50 kW and above, and to, bus and kind of medium and heavy duty vehicle. You won't find a lot of takers that'll say, let me just throw out a whole bunch of chargers without a bit of a clear line of sight on the actual vehicles that are going to take advantage of those chargers, except for folks like Tesla committing to build, a nationwide network. You think about our Electrify America and, Porsche and a couple of Rivian nowadays. But I think that you really got to have a bit of a hybrid approach. At the end of the day, you're going to have infrastructure, right? And I think that kind of goes without saying. I think there's some policy components to it. Like, I know I live in Atlanta. The city of Atlanta had passed an ordinance for like new building structure. I know in several parts of California, there's similar, again, regulation that, maybe not legislation, not regulation, but legislation was passed where, cities had to have a certain percentage of new builds with, electric vehicle stubbed up or fully built out capabilities. While at the same time, you still have to push for the vehicles to obviously be manufactured and make it to the various markets so that, you don't have such a big chasm that exists between these electric charging infrastructure that's been installed and actual vehicles are there and available for customers to buy, right, to actually take advantage of. So I would say, in terms of the multiple modes of transportation versus charger debate, I would say, or charging infrastructure debate, you really have to have both, right? You got to push the front where you're getting infrastructure teed up. You're getting folks on board from a regulatory and a policy perspective who see the vision, who kind of see and buy into the future. You also, got to, continue to be in the ear of manufacturers. We used to call it sort of coalition of the willing when you think about all the stakeholders around the table that need to be involved in a conversation and involved in the building out the marketplace. So anyway, I go back to say it's a bit of a hybrid approach where there are going to be certain territories or certain regions where one is more of a priority than the other, and then kind of vice versa. But if you're pushing infrastructure without a significant emphasis on the vehicles and the policy and the regulatory landscape, you may end up in a position where I think some of us who were around and can remember, under the Obama administration, a lot of infrastructure was put out there that turned into monuments, right? Unused charging, what is it, eco-tality, blink, those things at the very beginning of sort of the push. A lot of that stuff went unused, but again, it should be a hybrid approach.
So if anything, I think I heard some really good points again. So number one, focus on infrastructure, because it is going to be the enabling factor that allows people to buy their EVs and be able to bring them home, because normally you wouldn't buy the laptop that you have here if you cannot charge your laptop and use it at home either. Similar situation here. And I've been also hearing the chicken and egg, or sometimes people will also say a hot dog and a bun analogy, where which one comes first and all that. I really think the hot dog and the bun is a better analogy, because we need both, just like what Sean has mentioned, right? We need both. We need policies on both ends, both the infrastructure push end and also the vehicle availability and or affordability end, to really make this happen and really make this work. So I'm also curious about the panelists' thoughts when it comes to the infrastructure. Let's focus on the infrastructure a little bit more, since we talk about MUDs, right? For the infrastructure push, I'm curious about in terms of incentive programs or incentive structures or policies that you think will be helpful. Which one have you seen is one that you would like to be nationwide, implemented everywhere? That is your sort of like the magic wand moment for you. Which one would you pick and why?
So I'll play hokey pokey and jump out first. I think, and I didn't mention, I've worked on the manufacturer side to kind of a bit of a BD role, kind of central states here in the country, working with a lot of utilities, but from the manufacturer's perspective. And one of the things that, we used to advocate for was skin in the game, right? So providing an incentive structure that, allowed for offsetting a lot of the capital expense up front, but also, providing such that, that site host or that location where that infrastructure is being built, whether it's an apartment or workplace or what have you. I know we're talking about MUDs right now, that they have a vested interest in installing and utilizing to its fullest capability the infrastructure, right? So again, that's just an incentive structure to say, hey, we'll make 75% of sort of the capital costs available, 90%, pick a number, but whatever that number is, that's reasonable given the technology that's being targeted, right? Obviously, the upfront cost of a DC fast charger is a lot more than an L2, so it's harder to cover a bigger gap on the former as opposed to the latter. But an incentive structure that offers a significant financial incentive, but still promotes some skin in the game, such that those who are installing it have an incentive to actually maintain it, to try to advocate for its usage, whether it's proper signage, whether it's using it as an amenity and advertising that it exists for those in that community, those around the community to utilize it. And I guess the other thing, kind of tied in with the last comment, right, is making sure that there's sort of the awareness from a broad base of stakeholders. Not to say there needs to be everybody, including the chef in the kitchen, but that there's enough advocates who are aware and are fighting for this on several dimensions, right? The installation of the hardware, for pushing policies that support the requirement to have the hardware there, and a couple others around you have, ride and drives and manufacturers and all that kind of good stuff as a part of it. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like, I think early on, at least in my exposure early on, to this space was, people would try to take sort of a singular approach. Like there's a silver bullet that can deliver this increased adoption at a rapid pace. And I think over time, a lot of us have kind of coalesced around this idea that it's really going to take a village, right? I mean, it's because there's so many, competing factors, it's going to take more. So from an MUD perspective, you got to have an incentive structure that's attractive, but also keep skin in the game. But I think more broadly, you got to have that stakeholder alliance that's going to support, promote, and really value those charging, that charging infrastructure being built and placed into the MUD setting.
So when I think about this from the affordable housing side of multifamily, a lot of the funds that developers use are competitive, and so I think hardwiring in competitive points for so rather than the incentive in that way being less financial and more about who gets funded based on a priority. And so raising that priority, I think at HUD and those programs, USDA, Treasury, and as well as the tax credit programs that run through Treasury and the IRS.
Thank you, Jim. That is a really, really good point that I've heard before from a friend, from a colleague who is working in the energy efficiency funding or energy efficiency grant. They're trying to incorporate EV readiness into their giant energy efficiency retrofit grants, so that those who are or score based applications will get extra points for EV infrastructures. But I think that is a really cool idea that everybody here should, if you work in that area, I think that's a really good policy to go for. Brendan.
Honestly, I think between Sean and Jim, they kind of touched on the points that I would like to reach there, and I'll defer to them on those 2 points. But yeah, thank you, gentlemen. I actually learned a couple of things there myself.
Cool. And I guess just to summarize the points tiny bit for Sean, and please feel free to correct me if I didn't summarize your points correctly. From Sean's perspective, what would be good is to structure the incentive program to obviously help with the initial capital costs of this kind of infrastructure, because it tend to be high due to early adoption phase, lower utilization and things like that. But also make sure those who are being funded really have a skin in the game to really improve or really to promote the utilization of this infrastructure, so they does not become kind of drifted away or sunk investment that does not yield any tangible benefits. And in order to do that, awareness building is really important. And then from Jim mentioned that empowering EV infrastructure in the overall competitive process of grants awarding would be a good idea, because it brings awareness and obviously empowers EV infrastructure to be a more attractive thing to have. So we talked about infrastructure, and just to carry on this question a little bit more, pulling from some of the questions from the Q&A session. So someone from the crowd, Linda, mentioned that given the high cost of retrofitting multifamily units, for charging would be really high, which is something that I can attest towards. It's really expensive to do retrofitting. It's important to stop building new buildings, or stop the new buildings to be built without this kind of EV infrastructure. And we have seen a lot of interesting ways to require this, from building codes requirements to land use ordinances and things like that. And one of the comments in the Q&A also mentioned in New Jersey, there has been a new mandate passed for 15% of parking spaces to be EV ready. And of course, there are a lot of other examples all around the country, from Denver to state or cities in California, and also Seattle recently, or past year as well. I'm curious about, from the panelist perspective, do you think this EV readiness requirement gets us to where we want, or what would you like to see in terms of those policies to make it more effective, or whether if you think this is a good approach for the time being?
Yeah, I think Sean and Jim will have a little more insight here. So I just kind of want to give my experience of what we've done from our perspective as kind of the vehicle provider or the car share provider there. When we talked about skin in the game, you need to have advocates similar to like Envoy or different companies that really have a vested interest in developing these to kind of advocate for these programs. One of the programs that we deal with here in California subsidizes these retrofits for different programs. You apply for them, and a lot of times the dwellings themselves might not know what to do. They might not know how to apply for these programs. So having an advocate like a car share provider or a vehicle provider, scooter provider, whatever it is, to kind of advocate for those programs, I think is really big. Now, do I think that those programs are where they need to be? No, not yet. But I have seen great development in them. Obviously, we've talked about kind of what Jim is doing in Kentucky and expanding those outside of just the traditional urban areas. So I'd like to see a little bit more of that. And I think again, not to use the word advocate so many times, but when we have people that kind of push for these underserved communities to have these kind of subsidies, I think we see a lot of value there that people don't necessarily recognize. We're going to get a lot of policies and a lot of things in place for the new developments. But just really expanding on what we can do to retrofit some of these older units or some of these underserved communities, I think is where we have the biggest opportunity for expansion.
Thank you, Brandon. Jim, Sean?
I'm not even sure where to begin with this question. So Sean's probably going to be the smartest person on this. I think if you think about building code and really where does that leadership need to come from, right? So your codes officer and your state building codes, that makes me think about advocating at a state by state level, which is really tough if we're trying to talk about maybe national landscape here. So if I were thinking about it from a platform of advocacy, I would start with sort of a federal approach first and get some sort of key, sort of like, what are the benchmarks we want to reach over what period of time? And we've got, there's a lot of interest right now. And then you use that as your leverage as you think about where we want to go state by state, but your codes office will follow, I think, what policy you want to put in place. And it's not that easy, but that is as effectively how it goes. It's not just your code. At times you get into things like your appraisers as well, which are also organized by national as well as state level association. And I think you have to think about influencing. It feels to me like whether it's retrofit or new construction, either one that has to have the wiring, in some ways it follows a pattern that's already been done when we talk about things like energy efficient design and build. And so I think there are a whole lot of lessons from that universe of work that has been effective that we could probably replicate in a similar approach when it comes to influencing sort of trades and code.
Thank you, Jim. Sean, any interesting points you would like to provide?
Could you quickly recap that question?
Yeah, absolutely. My question, summarizing in one sentence, will be EV readiness requirements, which could come from either building codes or ordinances that require a certain percentage of the building's parking to be, equipped with the charging capability. Do you see that as a proper way to move forward, or do you think there's a better way to require or incentive or require EV readiness for infrastructure building?
Yeah, I think. Thank you for repeating that for me, Eric. I think that when you think about at a macro level, right? Starting new markets. How do they typically happen? There's some type of stick / carrot, right? And it's out there, and it's influencing the market enough to where the market will kind of stand up on its own 2 feet. And it'll activate and it'll take care of itself. I think that while there in some regulatory circles, there are conversations that the electric vehicle market is mature enough to stand on its own 2 feet. However, I don't personally believe or sort of, I don't personally have that same view. I think it's close, right? And I think as, pricing for vehicles, I'm taking a little bit of a circuitous path, so let me chop it down a little bit. But I think as pricing for vehicles and the technology that goes in those vehicles kind of come down, and maybe there's a little bit more sort of a synergies between the technologies for charging those vehicles, whether it's kind of moving towards a single standard across the board or what have you, or at least more robust availability and more robust access to the wide spectrum of technologies. I think that the market still has some maturing to go, right? And because of that, there needs to be, right, policy and sort of legislative requirement for both new build and retrofits, in my opinion, right? Obviously, those builders, certain builders may say, that's a cost, unnecessary cost, but at the end of the day, that'll be a cost that's passed through anyways. But I absolutely believe that having that on the books and in place will continue to help the market mature and grow to a point where, and we've seen it in some of the clients that we work with, we've seen it where it is being touted as an amenity, a differentiator, whereby you don't even have to require it, but that's not across the board, right? And that's certain use cases and sort of customer types, customer from a utility perspective, look at it as an amenity, a way to attract and retain, customers to their particular establishment. But again, I think that, you definitely have to have it on the books, at least for another 3 to 5 years as momentum continues to build and vehicles are made more widely available. Then it becomes, my estimation, it becomes less of you need to have an incentive on the books and more of, again, it is a differentiator for that particular housing complex. You have enough residents asking for it. And ultimately, the equation should flip where it becomes an asset that's valued enough where people are willing to pay for it, pay a premium. So, it helps, potentially turns into another line of business or, stream of income for, that MUD or that housing complex.
Yeah.
The revenue stream may be a little further down the road, but.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean, for pointing out that it is really important for us to try to build the awareness around that this is a desirable feature, a desirable amenity that people should want it, and also at the same time recognizing that beyond that, when it gets more affordable or price parity compared to ICE vehicles, it's also going to have significant implication when it comes to equal access or equitable access towards these kind of charging, not just amenity, but going to be just infrastructure overall. Brendan, one question from the crowd that I think would attract your attention, which is, who are the strongest advocates right now for getting EV car sharing into MUDs? And I can also expand this question towards the other two panelists as well, is from your perspective, or in your experience, if there's any, who might be the advocate for EV car sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll find a lot of early adopters, right? People that are just into technology, people that live in these buildings that want this amenity for themselves, that want to go without a second car or a car at all. So I think those people I found have been really strong advocates for different programs. Now, they might not always be in positions of power to kind of make these decisions, but those I think are some of our strongest advocates to really get the word out. I think one of the largest barriers here is just education. Friends that I know are highly intelligent and do a lot of things, just aren't that informed on EV technology and the benefit of it and how we would take to get there. Now, from the other perspective, like we deal with a program here in California called LACI, the Los Angeles Clean Energy Incubator. So programs like that, I think, are very, very strong advocates for kind of this infrastructure development, for providing the different vehicles that will be needed. And again, the education piece and providing all the peripherals that will come with it, developing apps, connecting scooters and cars and everything that is kind of the ecosystem that is here. So when you have programs, whether they be state municipalities or independent agencies that are heavily invested in this, I think those are probably the largest decision maker advocates. But in terms of getting that message out there, you find a lot of people that are just tech nerds like myself that are really going to be strong advocates to really getting other people that would actually use the service to really adopt.
Thank you, Brendan.
Absolutely.
Sean, I see you unmuted.
No, I'm not about to say anything here. I'll defer. I think Brandon's answer kind of captured it well. But I'll defer. Maybe Jim could chime in here.
Only if I want to make a mess of it. I thought you covered it really well, Brandon.
Thank you.
I don't have anything else to offer.
Cool. In that case, I think that's great that we answered that question pretty well. And I'm really going to leverage my power as a moderator rather than someone who normally end up on the panel answering questions, is open up this really interesting discussion to all of you. In MUD or multi-unit dwellings overall, apartment building, condo, doesn't matter. From the type of technology of level 1 low power charging to level 2 slightly faster AC charging to DC fast charger, overall 3 type of technologies, which one would you pick as the optimal selection or optimal option for MUD applications, and why? And if possible, is there a ratio between them that you would prefer?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick, so I think we'll have some more insight here from the other panelists, but level 1's not going to get us where we need to go. I definitely think that we're going to look at level 2 at least, just in terms of, especially if you're talking about any kind of sharing, any kind of reduction of vehicles on site. The need to charge quickly is a huge thing. Now, when we're talking about personal individual use, if you're talking about a multi-unit dwelling and you have infrastructure for people to use individually, I still think level 1 is going to be a little bit slow, but hey, it's better than nothing. I know kind of the barrier to entry to get level 3 chargers is going to be a lot. So I think really our focus would probably be on those level 2 chargers and getting those out to the people that need them and kind of informing them on the time. It's the same thing. A lot of kind of people's barrier of adoption there is that people are so used to using gas, instantaneously filling up their vehicles and going about their way. We have to kind of change the conversation in which, hey, this is a new way to do things. It provides a lot of benefits on the back end. You might have a couple of inconveniences getting to learn the new technology, but really getting that education piece out there, I think is important. But I'll let our other panelists kind of talk on more of the technical aspects of there.
Hey, Brandon, that's a good point. Where was I? I think I was in Oklahoma. This was almost 3 years ago now, but in Oklahoma, and was talking to a gentleman about, he was very, very bullish on the viability of level 1 technology. And obviously, that most of us in this space, don't necessarily think that has a long shelf life left. But, I think that short answer is high powered level 2 output. Right. So maybe higher than a 6.6 or 7.2 volts. So maybe if we can get something a little higher is kind of the way to go. If you have a large complex, then there's maybe more of an argument for DCFC and a lot of shared users to kind of spread the costs across, right, shared users. That makes a little more sense, but that's kind of stretching it from a, return on your investment. With that being said, and kind of taking the sort of evolving dynamic of the space as technologies change and faster charging is made possible and cheaper materials are being built into the batteries and higher energy density is being included and the range of vehicles continues to increase. I saw something, I guess the EQS from Mercedes bested Tesla's sort of single charge maximum, mileage output. That's going to put even more of a strain on that level 2 or lower, right? So it might make it again. So my original answer of higher power level 2 is kind of the way to go. It's sort of a long play. I don't see a way where a level 1 is viable in the long run unless you really don't go anywhere and you have sort of the first gen Nissan Leaf, right? 40 miles, 50, 60 miles over time.
Right.
But I do think that situationally, DC fast is too big of a too big of a chunk to bite out of the apple of costs, and that level 2 play is probably most feasible.
It all feels. I think I would totally agree with both of you on that, and I think going to level 1, having done a trip recently to Evansville, Indiana, which is several hundred miles. We had to go out of our way to go to downtown Louisville to charge because the overnight stay in Evansville, there was no place to charge at a hotel. And so I just think like pressing the envelope a bit to get to level 2 in multifamily dwellings makes a lot of sense, even if the payback is not there today. This is all about sort of learning as best we can and how far we can push it. And so and we don't look at it that way, right? Like when I think about like these kind of technological advances that we want to make available to people regardless of their income, it isn't about what's the payback. It's really just about saying what is the right thing to do and how close can we get the access to what anybody else in this country can get, and then just making the deal work around it, if you will. And so I'm inclined to press to what makes sense, and two at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Jim's practicality. What makes sense or what fits the needs of those users would be the most important factor. And also in terms of level 1, 2, 3, to be honest, this is really, there's no perfect answer towards this because every situation, every building is different and there's really no silver bullet. But level 2 being the minimum capability that it brings, combined with other technologies such as power sharing, such as load management, to interact with utility, interact with the grid overall. I think that is going to be probably what I consider to be the optimal solution because it's flexible. It allows people to recharge quickly when they need it. But of course, with level 2 and smart technology, it could also dwindle it down to react to any kind of grid activity or grid needs as well, so that utility could be benefited from it, hence passing down hopefully those savings towards the ratepayer as well. Which brings to another interesting, I would say, question coming out of the chat box or the Q&A session. When it comes to approaching utilities and also approaching key stakeholders, ranging from utility to the building owners to the tenants, what have been your experiences and what could be improved?
Sorry, Eric, can you just repeat that question real quick for me?
Yes. So when it comes to engaging key stakeholders, which is a wide range of them, you can pick anyone that you prefer to talk about. When you engage these key stakeholders like utilities, building owners or managers, and then also potentially MUD residents, in terms of promoting the benefit of electric transportation, what are some best ways that you have seen or where you think we can improve?
So I spend a lot of time on education. And just because you'll have a lot of people, regardless of the multi-unit dwelling, you probably see it more prevalent in underserved communities, but a lot of people have range anxiety. A lot of people don't understand generally that a electric car works the same way as a ICE vehicle in the sense that it drives and reverses and brakes and et cetera like that. So I think the education piece is huge. Educating residents, potential users of these vehicles and the infrastructure, I think that's huge. And I don't just mean, hey, this is here and available for you. But a lot of people have questions about how the charging. I even see things in the chat right now where people have differing views on kind of how a level 1 charger will work. So just having that education piece there, having resources for people to go and answer those questions on their own, whether it's just an app like a Plug Share app, which gives me a lot of information, even as somebody in the industry, I think is a huge piece. And again, I think we've talked about it a lot, just showing that value to these stakeholders. So showing what is the return on my investment here. But yeah, I'll let our other panelists speak a little bit more on that.
I might turn my attention to that. All makes a ton of sense, Brandon. I totally agree. And I think about other stakeholders tend to be like, who's going to finance this property? And why are you spending money on this? And like why would this matter? My financiers are going to be banks and government programs for the most part. and I have to sell it all the way up and down the chain. And I find, same. It's the same playbook though. It's about educating and being consistent with that message and making sure that we're delivering it now before we have to have all these things in place. This is when we have to sell it.
I echo that. I mean, there's no time better than being early, and early and often. And yes, you need to consider, kind of where the audience is and then meet them where they are with the relevant facts, to kind of speak to where they are. But engaging and educating and informing early and as often as possible is generally a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jim and Brandon. Really, I think those are really, really key points. Especially, I like how your answer really are grounded in your specific areas of background. So, really appreciate those. And there's a follow-up question for Brandon on the topic of education. Has Envoy tracked EV ownership within the community that you have served, or do you see any people using Envoy as a trial run before purchasing their electric vehicles?
That is a really, really good question. I'll even go back before Envoy. When I worked at General Motors, obviously our entire fleet wasn't electric, but one of the bigger questions I got from people was, hey, I was considering, purchasing an EV vehicle. Tell me the benefits of this. So yes, I have seen, even in some of the underserved communities, that people will then go out and buy electric vehicles. Now, I believe Sean touched on this earlier. The availability of affordable electric vehicles is still a challenge there, right? So even after the pandemic, the used car market is skyrocketed. Even a used Tesla, I think, cost about more than it did when it was new. So the used car market is a little wanky right now, but we do see a lot of people, both in higher income and in lower income facilities, going to go and buy these vehicles after they have a test run. So again, with that education piece, hands-on education, make the mistakes that you're going to make. And then those people also then turn around and become big advocates even before they've bought their own electric vehicle for the services or for electric vehicles in general. So yeah, no, great question there. Thank you for whoever asked that.
Yep. So recognizing that we have about 5 minutes left, I'm really trying to time as well. So I'm opening this question to all three panelists here, which is a little bit more open-ended. Well, and the question is, what are the one or two big picture items, which is another, magic wand moment that may move the needle to accelerate EV adoption amounts, large or small MUD buildings? Please feel free to ground it in your own experience and your own perspective as well. But feel free to name one or two big picture items that you think would move the needle and really push people towards adoption of EV at MUDs.
I'll just go back really quick to my last point about the availability of affordable vehicles. We just need more of that. And as the market is maturing, we're starting to see more as manufacturers are making cheaper vehicles. I mean, everybody knew about Tesla, but when the Tesla Model 3 came out, that's when Teslas became everywhere. So I think really having affordable vehicles, not even traditional sedans and SUVs, but any types of vehicles that might be appropriate for different communities, I think that is a big thing that's going to move this needle forward.
I think if Elon Musk would buy everybody a car and a charging station. So I think a complementary to where Brandon's coming from, sort of the supply of the vehicles themselves. I think about if across a sort of whole sort of supply chain or value chain of actors who can get the infrastructure in place, right? Like just from the multifamily side, we don't do this. Part of a project we're on is with a multitude of partners, and we're just one of the partners. We didn't even write the application, right? Like, so I got coerced, if you will, or invited in to something that wasn't on our radar very strong, and so I'm super grateful. But I think we need to think about, like, it's coming. The next decade is going to go by really quick, And particularly when we think about the economic mobility implications of communities and people being ready to participate in the way our world is going to work. I think it's going to take a multitude of actors. And so really, if there was sort of like a common goal and we were all working from our various standpoints to pull that off, that to me would be the game changer.
And I guess round out with, something that's maybe not as tangible for each one of us in our sort of day-to-day activities. But I'm kind of Brandon's point earlier about being a nerd. Or being nerdy, right? Not to mean to call you a nerd, Brandon.
No worries.
I think it's the advancement of technology and the money being pumped into it from, an infrastructure bill, that's kind of that's still TBD, but the technology to bring forward the longer range, the faster charging, the higher powered, maybe it doesn't even have to be higher power. Like, we don't have to have, a megawatt charging installation to charge something, really, really quickly, but it's all the technology involved. So anyway, again, it's a little less tangible in the near term, except for those at, some of our STEAM research labs. But I just encourage, right, the market to continue to push the envelope. We're a nation that we've brought forward some of the most incredible technological advances, and it just kind of bewilders me sometimes that, from a customer or user experience, like I shouldn't be waiting 45 minutes to charge up a Model S, but I can go to the gas station in my big old SUV and spend 5 minutes filling up a 25-gallon tank, So the sooner we can make the experience parallel and compatible from, ICE to EV, the better.
Cool. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Jim. These are really wonderful points regarding EV availability, or I should say EV infrastructure readiness for MUD buildings overall. And I would like to say, again, thank you for all of these really great points, especially drawing your experiences and special, I would say, knowledge coming from your own perspective. I think I have learned a lot today in terms of the different perspective of MUD infrastructure deployments coming from all of your background. So really appreciate that. And I would like to also make sure that all the panelists' contact information should be available and their bio should be available as well. So the attendees who want to reach out to the panelists, including me, the moderator, please feel free to. And also recognizing that we're at time, I like to mention that we're finished up with this discussion, and please feel free to move into our main stage for the next sessions, or I should say the next events of the conference. You can access the other one-on-one random networking features and everything as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again for all the great panelists for their great discussion, and thank you all, and have a wonderful early Thanksgiving as well.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Brandon,
thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jim.
See you guys.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Take care.